The train lurched to a stop somewhere in eastern Kansas. September 1943. The air outside smelled of wheat and diesel and something else, something the men inside the boxcar had not smelled in years. Fresh bread. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber pressed his face to the gap between two wooden slats. His cheekbones jutted sharp beneath sunken eyes. 6 weeks ago, he had been flying reconnaissance missions over North Africa. 4 weeks ago, his Messerschmitt had kissed the sand near Tunis, wings folding like paper. 2 weeks ago, he had stood on a pier in New York Harbor, shackled, watching the Statue of Liberty rise green and impossible against the morning sky. Now, he was here, wherever here was. The boxcar door slid open with a metallic scream. Sunlight flooded in, blinding. American soldiers stood outside, rifles casual on their shoulders. One of them, a baby-faced private with freckles, grinned and said something in English. Weber understood none of it, but he understood the gesture. Come on, get out. One by one, the prisoners climbed down. Their boots, those who still had decent boots, crunched on gravel. Weber's stomach twisted, not from fear, from the smell, that bread smell. And something else. Meat cooking. Real meat. Was it das? Someone whispered behind him. What is that? Weber had no answer. He had been told many things about America, that it was weak, that its soldiers were mongrels, that its people were soft, corrupted by jazz and decadence. But no one had told him it would smell like this, like abundance. The march across the compound felt dreamlike. Weber counted the guard towers, 4 visible, probably more behind the barracks. Barbed wire gleamed in the sun like jewelry. But the buildings themselves were solid. Wood. Not canvas. Roofs that didn't leak. And that smell, growing stronger with every step, pulling them forward like a rope around their ribs. They had been traveling for 9 days. The last hot meal had been in New York. Thin soup. Stale bread. Before that, aboard the transport ship, they had survived on hardtack and tinned fish that tasted like rust. Before that, in the North African holding camps, they had eaten British rations, tea so strong it burned, biscuits hard enough to break teeth, occasional bully beef that came from tins marked 1938. Weber's body had learned to run on nothing, to ignore the grinding in his stomach, to sleep through hunger. But now, with that smell in his nostrils, his body betrayed him. His mouth watered. His hands trembled. His mind, which had stayed disciplined through capture and transport and interrogation, began to fracture around a single thought. Please let it be real. Let me pull back for a moment. Let me show you what Friedrich Weber could not yet see. By the autumn of 1943, Germany was beginning to starve. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the arithmetic was brutal and unyielding. The Wehrmacht consumed 6 million tons of food annually. The Reich's agriculture, even with occupied territories, produced barely enough. The synthetic fuel plants, those concrete cathedrals that turned coal into gasoline, devoured resources that might have fed civilians. Every liter of ersatz gasoline meant fewer potatoes in Berlin. Every panzer rolling east meant tighter rations at home. In Hamburg, the daily bread ration had fallen to 250 grams less than 2 slices. In Munich, children learned to chew slowly, to make meals last. In the Ruhr Valley, factory workers fainted at their lathes, bodies running on fumes and propaganda. Housewives traded wedding rings for butter. Old men scavenged cigarette butts for tobacco. The black market thrived in the shadows, pricing flour like gold. The rationing had begun in 1939, almost immediately after the invasion of Poland. At first, it had seemed manageable, patriotic, even. Tighten your belt for the fatherland, share and sacrifice. But by 1943, the belt had no notches left. In Stuttgart, where Friedrich Weber's wife Elsa lived, the weekly ration was this: 250 grams of meat, 80 grams of fat, 1,600 grams of bread, 200 grams of sugar, 100 grams of cheese, occasionally an egg, if you were lucky. If the supply lines held, if the bombers didn't come that week. Elsa had learned to make soup from potato peels. She had learned to stretch a single onion across 3 days. She had learned to ignore the dizziness that came from standing too quickly, the way her vision would blur and darken at the edges. She had learned not to think about the past, about Sunday dinners with roasted pork and red cabbage, about Christmas stolen heavy with butter and almonds, about the simple, impossible luxury of feeling full. And yet, in Kansas, in Texas, in the sprawling grasslands of the American interior, German prisoners of war sat down to meals that would have made their families weep. The Geneva Convention mandated it. Prisoners must receive rations equivalent to the captor nation's garrison troops. America, untouched by bombs, flush with Midwestern wheat and Southern beef, fed its prisoners the same meals it fed its soldiers, which meant Friedrich Weber, enemy of the state, designated threat to democracy, was about to eat better than his wife in Stuttgart. The absurdity of this would not be lost on him. But first, he had to survive the disbelief. They entered the mess hall. Weber stopped. The men behind him stopped. For a moment, no one spoke. The hall was vast, clean, lined with long tables covered in white oilcloth. Electric lights hung overhead. Not candles, not oil lamps, but bright, steady electric lights that turned everything sharp and shadowless. But it was not the space that stunned them. It was what sat on those tables. Trays. Metal trays, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows. And on those trays, pork chops. Thick, glistening, still hot from the grill. Each one the size of Weber's palm. Mashed potatoes with butter melting into yellow pools. Green beans, glossy with fat. Bread rolls, white and soft, steam still rising from their split tops. Coffee, actual coffee, not the roasted barley or Sans Café they'd choked down for years, but real coffee, steaming in tin cups, dark and bitter and impossibly rich. And there, at the end of each tray, a slice of apple pie, golden crust, cinnamon sugar crystals catching the light. Mein Gott, someone breathed behind Weber. An American sergeant shouted something. The prisoners did not move. They could not move. It felt like a trap, like the kind of cruelty that offers hope before snatching it away. Weber had seen that before Red Cross parcels opened for inspection, then confiscated. Water promised, but never delivered. Bread used as punishment, held just out of reach until men broke. The sergeant shouted again, louder, gesturing with both hands. Sit, eat, what are you waiting for? Still, no one moved. Around Weber, men stood frozen in postures of disbelief. Some stared at the food. Some stared at the floor. One young Gefreiter, couldn't have been more than 19, had tears streaming down his face. Silent, unashamed. The sergeant sighed, exasperated. He walked to the nearest tray, picked up a fork, and cut into a pork chop. The knife slid through like silk. He speared a piece, brought it to his mouth, chewed deliberately, swallowed. Then he grinned, wide and mocking. See? Not poisoned. Just food. Now sit down and eat before it gets cold. Slowly, hesitantly, the prisoner's Saturday Weber slid onto the bench. The wood was smooth, polished. The tray in front of him was warm. He picked up his fork. Solid, heavy, real metal. Not the tin spoons they'd been given on the ship. His hand shook. He cut into the pork chop. The knife slid through. He brought the fork to his mouth. The taste exploded. Salt, fat, char from the grill. Substance. His eyes watered. He did not know if it was from the food or from shame or from the sheer crushing weight of contrast. 3 months ago he had flown over enemy lines, convinced of German superiority, convinced that the Reich represented civilization's apex, that Germany's strength was unmatched. Now he sat in a prisoner camp in Kansas, eating better than any soldier in the Wehrmacht. Better than his officers. Better than his family. Better than his wife. Around him, men ate in silence. Some wept quietly, forks moving mechanically from plate to mouth. Others ate with desperate speed, as if afraid the food would vanish, as if they might wake and find it all a dream. One man, a Feldwebel from Bavaria, with an iron cross ribbon still pinned to his threadbare tunic, laughed, a broken, hysterical sound that bordered on sobbing. Sie haben uns angelogen, he said, the words thick and wet. They lied to us. Weber did not ask who they were. He knew. Goebbels had lied. The newsreels had lied. The propaganda posters showing Americans as weak, as decadent, as teetering on collapse all lies. The man next to Weber picked up his coffee cup with both hands, like it was something sacred. He brought it to his lips, sipped, closed his eyes. "Kaffee," he whispered. "Echte Kaffee. Real coffee." Weber finished his pork chop, then his potatoes, then his green beans, which tasted like they'd been cooked with bacon, then his bread roll, which was so soft it dissolved on his tongue, then his coffee, scalding and bitter and perfect. And finally, with trembling hands, he picked up his fork and cut into the apple pie. The crust crumbled. The filling was sweet, tart, spiced with cinnamon and something else he couldn't name. He closed his eyes, chewed slowly, swallowed, and in that moment Friedrich Weber understood something he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The war was over. Not officially, not yet, but in every way that mattered, it was over. You could not fight a nation that fed its prisoners like this. You could not win against an enemy whose surplus was your feast. Here is what Friedrich Weber did not yet understand, but would come to grasp in the weeks ahead. America was a different kind of empire. Germany's war machine ran on scarcity. Every bullet, every liter of fuel, every crust of bread was allocated, rationed, squeezed from a system stretched to breaking. The Third Reich was a marvel of efficiency born from desperation. It had to be. It had no choice. The entire German economy had been reorganized around the principle of Wehrwirtschaft defense economy. Everything served the war effort. Civilian needs came second, third, last. Albert Speer's ministry tracked every ton of steel, every kilowatt of electricity, every rail car of coal. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was surplus. The system worked, after a fashion, but it worked on the edge of collapse. Always one miscalculation away from catastrophe. America ran on surplus. The United States in 1943 produced more steel than Germany, Britain, and Japan combined. Its farms yielded grain enough to feed not only its own population and military, but also to ship millions of tons to allies overseas through the Lend-Lease program. Its factories churned out bombers and jeeps and boots faster than they could be deployed. In Detroit, assembly lines built a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. In the Midwest, farms produced so much wheat that silos overflowed, grain piling up faster than it could be transported. And its prisoner camps? They were a rounding error. Feeding 37,000 German POWs in the Midwest cost less than a single day's production at a Ford assembly plant. The pork chops Friedrich Weber ate came from hogs raised in Iowa, surplus inventory that would have been exported or stored anyway. The bread came from Kansas wheat, fields so vast a man could walk for hours and see nothing but gold stretching to the horizon. The coffee came from South American plantations, shipped north in quantities that beggared imagination. This was not mercy. It was not even generosity. It was logistics. It was the cold, inevitable math of a nation that simply had more. A nation whose industrial capacity was so vast, whose agricultural output so enormous, that it could afford to feed its enemies the same rations it fed its own sons. But to the prisoners, it felt like revelation. Weber learned the rhythm of the camp quickly. Wake at 6, roll call at 6:30, breakfast at 7, oatmeal, toast, jam, coffee, work details from 8 to noon, harvesting sugar beets in the surrounding fields, the landscape so flat and empty it made him dizzy. Lunch at noon, sandwiches, soup, fruit, more work until 4, dinner at 5, meat, vegetables, bread, dessert. Free time until 9, lights out at 10. Every day, without fail. The meals arrived like clockwork, like the tides, like something ordained by physics rather than politics. Weber kept a mental tally, comparing what he ate to Elsa's rations. By the end of his first week, he had consumed more meat than she would see in a month. By the end of his first month, he had eaten more butter than she would receive in 6 months. The disparity grew, compounding, until it became too large to comprehend. He was not alone in this reckoning. In the barracks at night, men talked in whispers. They compared notes, sharing letters from home, those that got through the censors, anyway. The letters spoke of rations shrinking, of children begging for bread, of women trading family heirlooms for eggs, of old men dying in their sleep, bodies simply giving out. And here they were, prisoners, defeated, captured, eating 3 meals a day, gaining weight, growing stronger while their families withered. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. The Germans in Camp Concordia, Kansas, were not the only ones grappling with this revelation. Across dozens of camps from Texas to Wyoming, from Georgia to Michigan, prisoners confronted the same brutal arithmetic. In Camp Hearn, Texas, prisoners were served fried chicken, cornbread, and peach cobbler. They ate at tables with tablecloths. They drank iced tea. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher from Dusseldorf, wrote in his diary, "I have not eaten this well since before the war began. My children would not believe me if I told them." In Camp Trinidad, Colorado, they ate steak. Actual steak, grilled medium rare, served with baked potatoes and fresh vegetables. A lieutenant from Hamburg refused his first portion, convinced it was a test, a trick to make them soft or compliant. His bunkmate ate it instead. The next day, the lieutenant accepted his meal. By the end of the week, he had gained 3 kilograms. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, they tasted gumbo, spicy, strange, impossibly rich with sausage and chicken and shrimp. In Camp McLean, Texas, they ate barbecue brisket that had been smoking for 14 hours. In Camp Dermot, Arkansas, they had catfish fried golden and crispy, served with hush puppies and coleslaw. The food was relentless. It was overwhelming. It was impossible to reconcile with everything they had been taught. They had been raised on Goebbels' vision of America, a nation of gangsters and Jews, a mongrel state teetering toward collapse, its people weak, its soldiers cowardly, its economy propped up by Jewish finance and doomed to implode under its own decadence. And yet, the guards were neither cruel nor cowardly. They were farmers' sons from Nebraska, dock workers from Baltimore, mechanics from Detroit. They chewed gum. They listened to swing music on portable radios. They showed pictures of their girlfriends, their cars, their dogs. Some were bored. Some were kind. A few were indifferent, but none fit the caricature. They did not seem weak. They did not seem desperate. They seemed, if anything, casually confident, the confidence of men who knew their side was winning, who knew that back home the factories were running and the farms were producing and the ships were sailing and the bombers were flying, an endless stream of material pouring off assembly lines faster than the enemy could destroy it. Weber watched them carefully. The way they laughed, the way they complained about minor inconveniences, a delayed mail delivery, a scratchy uniform, bad weather. They had the luxury of complaining about small things. That, more than anything, told him what he needed to know. Some prisoners refused to believe it was real. They suspected the camps were elaborate propaganda, that the Red Cross inspectors were being deceived, that beyond the wire lay the real America, the broken, starving America they had been promised. But slowly, understanding seeped in. America was not starving. America was not broken. America was enormous. Weber began writing letters 2 weeks into his captivity. The censors would read them, he knew. So he chose his words carefully. "My dear Elsa, I am well. The Americans treat us fairly according to the Geneva Convention. We work in the fields during the day, harvesting beets, mostly. The labor is hard but not cruel. The weather here is strange, very hot during the day, cool at night. The landscape is flat beyond imagining. I think sometimes I can see the curvature of the earth. We are fed adequately." He paused, stared at the word adequately. It felt like a betrayal. Not to Elsa, but to truth itself. Adequately. 3 meals a day. Meat most days. Vegetables. Bread that was not sawdust. Butter that was not margarine. Coffee that was not acorns roasted into bitterness. Dessert. Dessert. He crossed out adequately and wrote instead, "We are fed." What could he say? That he had gained 8 kilograms in 2 months? That his ribs no longer showed? That his gums had stopped bleeding? That the American guards sometimes shared cigarettes? That the camp had a library with German books? That on Sundays they played football in the yard and the guards bet cigarettes on the outcome? How could he write that without making it sound like he had forgotten? Forgotten the bombs falling on Stuttgart. Forgotten the friends who died in the sand at El Alamein. Forgotten his wingman Hans, who burned alive when his plane caught fire over Tobruk. Forgotten that his nation was fighting for survival while he sat in Kansas, fat and safe and ashamed. "I think of you every day," he wrote. "I hope you are well. I hope there is enough Please give my love to your mother and to little Hans if you see them. Tell them I am coming home. Tell them I am safe. I hope there is enough. He did not say, I hope there is enough bread. I hope you are not starving while I feast on your enemy's charity. I hope you do not hate me for being captured. I hope you forgive me for surviving. He folded the letter, sealed it, handed it to the American corporal who collected mail every Tuesday. The corporal was a kid from Ohio, 20 years old, with red hair and a sunburned nose. He handled the letters gently, almost reverently. To your sweetheart? The corporal asked in halting German, proud of the few words he had learned. Weber nodded. She's lucky, the corporal said, switching back to English. You'll be home someday. War can't last forever. Maybe she'll make you a nice dinner when you get back. Weber smiled back, hollow. He thought of Elsa's last letter, smuggled out before he was captured, delivered to him in North Africa just days before his plane went down. She had mentioned standing in line 3 hours for turnips. Turnips. Not even potatoes. Just turnips, woody and bitter. And she had been grateful. Yes. Someday he would go home, and he would sit across from her at their small table in their small apartment, and she would serve him whatever she could, scrape together cabbage soup, maybe, or potato pancakes made thin as paper to stretch the rations. And he would eat it, and he would tell her it was wonderful, and he would not tell her about the pork chops in Kansas. He would not tell her about the apple pie. He would not tell her that for 2 years he ate better as a prisoner than she did as a loyal citizen of the Reich. Some truths were too cruel to speak. Friedrich Weber never spoke openly about what he learned in Kansas. Not to the other prisoners, some were true believers, still convinced that Germany would develop a wonder weapon, that the Führer had a plan, that victory was possible if they just held on. He did not argue with them. What was the point? Not in letters home, the censors would black it out, or worse, the letters would never arrive, and Elsa would worry. But he wrote it down, in a journal hidden beneath his bunk, pages torn from a notebook the camp authorities had provided for educational classes. November 1943. Today, I understood something. This war cannot be won. Not by us. I do not mean that we lack courage, or that our soldiers are not brave. They are. They fight with honor. But the arithmetic does not work. You cannot fight a nation that produces food like this, steel like this, airplanes by the thousands. You cannot win when your enemy's surplus feeds its prisoners better than your own civilians. The Feldwebel from Munich said tonight that Germany will develop new weapons, rockets, jets, bombs that can level cities. Maybe we will. Maybe we already have. But it doesn't matter. For every jet we build, the Americans build 100 bombers. For every tank we produce, they produce 10. For every soldier we field, they can field more, and feed them better, and arm them better, and replace them when they fall. And yet we go on. Because we must? Because to stop is to admit we were wrong from the beginning? Because surrender means dishonor? I do not know anymore. December 1943. Winter here is cold, but not cruel. The barracks are heated. We have wool blankets. Today, for Christmas dinner, we had roast turkey, mashed, potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, vegetables, rolls, and pumpkin pie. It was absurd. It was obscene. Some of the men wept. The guards seemed embarrassed by our emotion. I thought of Elsa. I thought of what she is eating today. If she is eating today, the rations are worse now, according to the letters that get through. The bombing is constant. The war is coming home. And I am here, safe, warm, fed. What kind of man survives like this? March 1944. News has reached us, rumors, mostly, but persistent, that the Russians are pushing west, that the Allies will invade France soon. The guards talk openly about it, confident, planning for after the war like it is already won. Some prisoners still believe we can hold, that the Atlantic Wall is impregnable, that the Luftwaffe will rise again. I say nothing, but I think, you have not seen what I have seen. You have not tasted what I have tasted. You have not done the arithmetic. This nation that feeds us like this, they are not winning because they are stronger or braver. They are winning because they have more. More of everything. And they can afford to be generous with their prisoners because the cost of generosity is nothing to them. We built our Reich on discipline and sacrifice. They built their empire on abundance and surplus. I do not know which is more moral, but I know which is more powerful. He closed the journal, hid it again, wrapped in a spare undershirt, tucked between the mattress and the bunk frame. Outside, men played cards in the evening Sunday. Someone had a harmonica, playing a folk song from Bavaria, slow and melancholy. The smell of dinner, beef stew tonight, with fresh bread drifted from the mess hall. Weber thought of Elsa. He thought of the Ruhr Valley, bombed into rubble. He thought of U-boats sinking in the Atlantic, of Stalingrad, of Kursk, of all the boys who would never come home, who died believing the propaganda, believing in final victory, believing that their sacrifice meant something. And he thought, we were told we were superior. We were told we would triumph because our cause was just, because our will was stronger, because we were racially and culturally destined to rule. But no one told us the enemy would feed us like this while our families starved. No one told us that ideology cannot fill an empty stomach. No one told us that you cannot eat propaganda. The cruelty was not in the camps. The cruelty was in the contrast. In knowing that this kindness, this mundane, bureaucratic kindness of the Geneva Convention, was something Germany could never afford to offer in return. Germany had no surplus. Germany had efficiency, discipline, will. But will does not feed armies. Will does not power tanks. Will does not keep people alive when the rations fail. America had surplus. And surplus, Weber was learning, was more powerful than any ideology. The war ended. Friedrich Weber went home in 1946, processed through a displacement camp in France, loaded onto a train with hundreds of other prisoners, all of them thinner again, worn down by the knowledge of what awaited them. Elsa met him at the train station in Stuttgart. She was gaunt. Her dress hung loose on a frame that had once been fuller, softer. Her face was all angles. Her eyes were too large. The city around them was skeletal, gutted by bombs, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble and dust. The air smelled of ash and decay. They embraced. Her body felt fragile, like she might break. He held her carefully. They walked home in silence. The streets were full of ghosts, former soldiers in ragged uniforms, women in threadbare coats, children with hollow eyes. Everyone moved slowly, conserving energy. No one met anyone else's gaze. Their apartment building had survived, mostly. The roof leaked, the windows were broken, covered with boards. The stairwell smelled of mildew and despair, but it was standing. That was something. Inside their small apartment, Elsa busied herself in the kitchen. She moved with practiced efficiency, making something from nothing. Weber sat at the table and watched her. Her hands were rough, scarred from work. Her wedding ring hung loose, spinning on her finger. She brought him soup, cabbage, mostly water, a few small potatoes. It was all she had. She apologized, eyes downcast, ashamed that this was all she could offer her husband after 2 years apart. Weber ate without complaint. But his hands shook. The soup was thin, flavorless. He could see the bottom of the bowl through the broth. He thought of the beef stew in Kansas. He thought of the pork chops. He thought of the apple pie, and the butter, and the coffee, and the bread. He thought of the weight he had gained, the health he had recovered, the meals that had sustained him while Elsa starved. "What is it?" she asked finally, watching him. He looked at her, at the hollow of her cheeks, at the wedding ring loose on her finger, at the way her collarbones jutted sharp beneath her dress. "I was in America," he said. "In a prisoner camp." "I know. They fed us," he said. The words came out strangled. "They fed us pork chops, bread, butter, coffee, every day, 3 meals a day. We had dessert. We had..." He stopped. His voice broke. Elsa said nothing. She watched him, her expression unreadable. "I gained weight," Weber continued. "While you stood in line for turnips, while you starved, I gained weight. I was healthy. I was safe. I ate better as a prisoner than you did as a free woman." The silence stretched between them, vast and terrible. Then Elsa reached across the table, took his hand. Her fingers were cold, thin, but her grip was strong. "You survived," she said. "That is enough." But it was not enough. Not for him. For the rest of his life? Friedrich Weber would carry the weight of that contrast. The knowledge that he had been fed by the enemy while his own people starved, that the system he served, the ideology he fought for, could not even feed its own, that he had eaten apple pie while his wife traded her mother's jewelry for turnips. He never forgot the smell of bread in Kansas, and he never quite forgave himself for how good it tasted. They never spoke of it again, not in detail. It became one of those silences that married couples carry, a space between them that neither dared to cross. But sometimes, at dinner, he would watch Elsa eat slowly, carefully, even years later when food was no longer scarce, and he would see in her movements the memory of hunger, the discipline of rationing, the years when every bite mattered. And sometimes she would watch him push food around his plate, appetite lost, and she would understand without words what haunted him, that he had survived by eating the enemy's surplus while she nearly died on the fatherland's scraps. Some contradictions cannot be resolved, they can only be endured. War is often remembered in victories and defeats, in battles and borders redrawn. We remember D-Day and Stalingrad, the fall of Berlin and the raising of flags. We remember the grand sweep of history, armies clashing, nations rising and falling. But sometimes, history is recorded in smaller truths, in the truth of a pork chop on a metal tray, in the truth of a man weeping over mashed potatoes, in the truth that one nation's surplus was another nation's starvation. By the war's end, over 370,000 German prisoners had been held in camps across the United States. They worked on farms and in factories. They harvested crops and built roads. They were paid in scrip, kept in barbed wire compounds, counted and catalogued and controlled, and they were fed every day, 3 meals, meat and vegetables and bread and dessert. The cost to the United States was minimal, a fraction of a percent of the overall war budget. The food came from surplus stocks, from farms producing more than the nation could consume, from an agricultural system so vast that feeding enemy prisoners was merely a logistical inconvenience, not a burden. But the psychological cost to the prisoners was immense. They returned home after the war, those who survived the journey, those who were not held for years in Soviet camps, those who made it back at all, and they returned changed, not broken, necessarily, not all of them, but altered, marked by the knowledge of what they had seen. They had seen the other side. They had tasted it, literally, and no propaganda, no ideology, no amount of rationalization could erase that. Some returned home ashamed, unable to meet their families' eyes, unable to speak of the meals they had eaten while their loved ones starved. Some returned defiant, clinging to the old beliefs, insisting that Germany had been betrayed, that the cause was still just, even if the outcome was not. Some returned pragmatic, accepting the defeat, ready to rebuild. But all of them returned with the same understanding, whether they admitted it or not. The war had been lost not just on the battlefield, but in the arithmetic of resources, in the cold calculation of production versus consumption, in the brutal fact that you cannot sustain an empire on ersatz coffee and turnip rations when your enemy drowns in wheat and beef. Friedrich Weber died in 1983 in Stuttgart, in the same apartment where he had eaten cabbage soup with Elsa on his first night home. He died quietly, in his sleep, an old man finally at rest. In his desk drawer, his children found the journal he had kept in Kansas. They read it once, slowly, passing the pages between them in silence. Then, they put it away. Some truths are too heavy to carry forward. Some contradictions are too painful to inherit. But the truth remains, recorded in ration cards and Geneva Convention reports, in Red Cross inspections and prisoner testimony, in the mundane bureaucracy of logistics that decided the war's outcome as surely as any battle. There was a day, many days in fact, hundreds of them, when German POWs ate better than civilians back home. And in those meals, in that absurd and terrible contrast, the war's outcome was written as clearly as any communique from the front. Abundance defeated scarcity, surplus defeated ideology, logistics defeated will, and sometimes history is decided not by the bravest soldiers, but by the simplest meals, by who eats and who starves, by who can afford to be generous and who cannot afford to survive. The prisoners in Kansas ate pork chops while their families ate turnips. And in that simple, undeniable fact lay the whole truth of the war.